Hi there. My name is Eva Cordery and I work at the Centre for Applied Linguistics at Hasselt University in Belgium. And in this short presentation, I would like to take a step back from the granularity of the CEFR and take a look at two concepts that are becoming more prominent, or certainly have become more prominent in the updated companion volume for the CEFR. And those concepts are mediation and plurilingual competences. So taking a look at the descriptor scales added in the CEFR Companion Volume 2020, we can see that there are two concepts, mediation and plurilingual competencies, that have been elaborated on. And these are the two things that I would just like to look at in a little bit more detail so we can, pick apart the concepts and take a look at where some things may have been taken for granted. So let's start by taking a look at the concept of mediation. In the 2001 companion volume, mediation was defined as learners or social agents acting as an intermediary or reprocessing an existing text. Now in 2020, or the 2020 edition, that has changed somewhat, where mediation is defined as the pivot of a holistic ecological view of language use and learning, which is informed by the plurilingual and the pluricultural dimension. So as you can see in the 2020 volume, mediation and plurilingual and pluricultural dimension are drawn together to form interlinking concepts, as it were. So how are they linked, in fact? Well, in the scale of building on the pluricultural repertoire, the learner or the social agent mobilizes their own repertoire in different languages. So that's how the plurilingual aspect comes to play. How do they do this, or when did they do this? For a purpose or for explaining a problem or asking for clarification at the A2 level, to facilitate comprehension with or between third parties at the B2 level, so that the mediation happens through the languages, to create the conditions for others to use different languages at the B2 level. So here, the role modeling to create the conditions for the others signals the openness to linguistic plurality, or to facilitate communication by using all their agency in a multilingual context in which they can alternate between languages and also employ different forms of linguistic or textual mediation. And that's at the C1 level. So here, they're not just mediating through language, but they are also mediating between people in a social context. The next set of descriptors that have also been updated are, of course, those of the plurilingual and pluricultural competences. Now, for the purpose of this presentation, I'm just going to focus on the plurilingual aspect of this competence set, and we'll take a look at this in further detail in the next slide. So let's take a look at the plurilingual competence in a little bit more detail. The pluricultural competence, I'm just going to park or disregard for now and focus on the linguistic aspect. The best way I think plurilingualism can be explained is by contrasting it with multilingualism. So multilingualism is the coexistence of different languages either at the social or the individual level. Plurilingualism, however, is the developing of a dynamic and ever-changing linguistic repertoire of a single learner. So rather than knowing different language sets, you are developing one single repertoire from which to draw on depending on the context and depending on the person that you're speaking to. So, for instance, people talking to each other may switch from one language or one dialect to another as the conversation progresses, in order to maximize the communication between each other. So here, within the plurilingual context, the aim of language is completely modified. So it's no longer the aim to replicate a language as the ideal native speaker would speak it, but instead we are aiming to develop a linguistic repertoire in which all the different linguistic abilities have a place, and then for the language learner to understand when to grasp which part of that repertoire, be it in a different language or a different dialect. So here is where I come to the crux of the presentation and also my problem statement, which is plurilingualism as a concept problematic? Now, I would argue that certainly it is, because when we look at existing plurilingual systems, they are in fact classified or defined as pidgin languages. So pidgin languages is when speakers of different languages need to communicate, usually to carry out practical tasks, but they do not speak a common language and they don't have the opportunity to learn it. They develop a makeshift jargon which is called a pidgin language. Now, within the CEFR, if we are looking at a European context, if we draw on those plurilingual competences to a large extent, we will end up with some sort of Euro-Pidgin, which will be largely, English based, but will draw upon different languages within the EU. If we look at it potentially in a Cuban context, we might end up talking Spanglish with each other, where a language learner of English will insert words in Spanish, drawing on that plurilingual context, and doing that, we will end up with, again, a pidgin language that will vary along the lines of the languages that are spoken by the language learner. The plurilingual competence is also problematic from a language teaching perspective. So let's say, for example, that an English student cannot think of an expression while they're conversing, let's say with their teacher, cannot think of an English expression off the top of their head, but they can think of, for example, a Spanish equivalent. Now, how does that English teacher assess that competence if they, for example, do not speak Spanish themselves? So the plurilingual competence and the mediation competence, the two that are interlinked, to me are problematic. And I'm just going to leave off with a quote by David Crystal, which is that a linguistically or dialectically diverse nation needs a standard language to permit mutual intelligibility. And so we need to bear that in mind when we think about the plurilingual competences and how we can, of course, assess those in language learners. Thank you very much for your attention.